Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to our lecture series on Japanese history. And today I'm going to continue talking about the Middle Ages in Japan, and specifically I'm going to talk about the Warring States period, called Sengoku Jidai in Japanese. And it's just going to be a short talk, and then after that, I'm going to explain a project um, analyzing a primary source from the time that we can do in tandem with this lecture. Okay, so picking up at the Warring States period, and then this is continuing from our talk last time where we left off looking at the Muromachi period and rule by the Ashikaga shoguns. And this rule by the Ashikaga shoguns began to break down in the 1460s, and there was fighting in the capital and provinces between daimyo armies for a period of 10 years between 1467 to 1477, called the Onin War, or Onin no Ran in Japanese. And this period of fighting then began a much longer period of a kind of continual warfare that lasted for about a century and is called the Warring States period, or Sengoku Jidai. And this lasted until 1568. And it's commonly thought of as a time of upheaval and gekokujo, which means those from below overthrow those who are above them. So hierarchies of power were really shifting at this time. And most of the power then shifted from central administrators in Kyoto, in Heian-kyo, the capital, to local leaders called kokujin and later called daimyo, who lived on the land that they controlled, and they ruled through military might, a combination of military might, commerce, and taxation. And the daimyo were constantly fighting and wrestling for power. They would suppress opponents within their domains and compete with other daimyo from other domains to expand their land and territory. And to accommodate this lifestyle, then, they needed secure kind of military fortresses. So they built large castles, then, which were very difficult for invading armies to attack. But they also weren't very comfortable places to live. So towns sprung up around those castles, with samurai, for instance, living in kind of barracks around the castles or in the castle grounds. And then average people, peasants, people engaged in commerce and farmers would live, then further out, kind of in many times in like a concentric circle around the castle. And daimyo, they each had their own styles of rule. They issued their own codes of conduct and many times their own laws to those living in their domains. These castles that they built were many times built on high plains or hills or even mountains, giving them a broad view of the land and would enable them to see invading armies coming from a distance. These castle towns were known as Joukamachi. They were also places not just of military defense, but trade, commerce, and places where people went about their daily lives as well. Along with this, there were two other types of towns that were common in the Warring States period. One was port towns, called Minatomachi, like Hakata, Sakai, and Nagasaki. And these were mainly focused around trade, trade between Kyoto and Osaka area and Edo, but also international trade between mainland Japan and China. And many Chinese ships would come through Nagasaki. Also, Portuguese traders and some of the first Europeans then would begin to come into Nagasaki and to trade and to also bring other kinds of knowledge and goods as well. And then the third type of town were temple towns called Monzenmachi, which developed on the main roads to shrines and temples, but they also flourished in their own right as commercial districts, which sold mainly religious goods to travelers and pilgrims. So I mentioned Europeans in the last slide, and during this time, then the Warring States period, some of the first Europeans began to reach the shores of Japan. And one such person who is very well known in Japan is the Spanish Jesuit priest Francis Xavier. He was originally encouraged to come to Japan and to preach and to evangelize and convert people to Christianity by a man simply named as Anjiro, who he met and gave him some information about Japan. And so Xavier left to go there in 1541 and didn't arrive until 1549 when he finally made his way to Kagoshima. And he had some success. He made about 100 converts, but after traveling for about a year to go to Kyoto and arriving in Kyoto, he was unsuccessful in his attempts to meet with Emperor Gonada. And he was going to ask Gonada then for permission to preach throughout Japan, but this was ultimately unsuccessful, and so he left the country in 1551. Another relatively famous European who arrived in Japan was also a Jesuit priest, Louie Freud. And he arrived in Japan in 1563 and stayed until his death in 1597. So this is already, after then the end of the Warring States period and getting into the next period that we'll talk about in the next lecture as three main unifiers, first starting with Oda Nobunaga, begin to unify the country. So anyway, Louie Freud was in Japan for quite a while, and throughout that time, he recorded his observations of Japanese society. He also made a lot of friends in high-up places, including Oda Nobunaga, and he had many chances to observe Nobunaga in his attempts to secure his power and to try to unify Japan. So he was able to see a lot of things and to write a lot of things and send these records back to Europe. We'll look at this in the next slide. We'll look at this a little bit more. And then Portuguese traders also arrived in Tanegashima in 1543 and brought the first musket to Japan. And Tanegashima is an island in the south part of Japan off the coast of Kagoshima. Today it's famous for launching where the Japanese Space Agency launches rockets into space, but back then it was famous for the first muskets being brought into the country. And as we'll see in a later talk, this was very important then toward the end of the Warring States period as daimyos began to use these new weapons and to try to gain leverage over their opponents. But I want to look in a little more detail at the writings of Louie Freud, and some of his observations have been compiled in a number of different works. One of them translated and compiled by Robin Gill, called Topsy Turvy 1585. And another is the first European description of Japan, and this is published by Routledge, and this is just some of, this is also then some of Louis Freud's writings and observations. So they're contained mainly in these 2 volumes, and some of them are just kind of these little tidbits, basically ranging from the mundane descriptions of daily life to much more intricate descriptions of the power politics of the time. And it's also important to point out that many of Louis Freud's observations, even though he was in Japan for quite a while, end up being rather stereotypical, and it seems as if he's kind of just perpetuating stereotypes and not really able to perceive, how things might actually have been, or he's in a way perpetuating his own biases at times as well. But here's some examples. So the staple of our diet is bread. The staple of our diet is bread made from wheat. The Japanese ordinarily eat rice cooked with no salt. Okay, well, that seems straightforward enough. Our tables are already set before the meal is brought out. Their tables are brought out from the kitchen along with the meal. So all of these, talking about diet, daily living. When we eat, we sit on chairs so that we can extend our legs. They sit on the tatami or on the floor with their legs crossed. But then he also talked about, law and forms of punishment. Among us, people are not crucified. This is very common in Japan. So he's talking about now capital punishment, and a form of capital punishment that, unsurprisingly, was not popular in mainly Christian Europe. But then here's another example of a longer writing of Louis Freud's, and I'll read all of this. It's a bit long, but what he's doing is describing a time when he was observing Oda Nobunaga and the building, and when Nobunaga was building his castle. Nobunaga built a castle there, the like of which has never been seen before in Japan. First of all, he gave orders for both temples to be raised, and then commandeered the site, measuring 4 streets long and 4 wide. All the princes and nobles of Japan came to help in the building operations. Usually there were from 15,000 to 25,000 men at work, all dressed in cloth breeches and short jackets made of skins. When he went around supervising the operations, he carried his sword in his hand or rested it on his shoulder, or else he carried a baton in his hand. As there was no stone available for the work, he ordered many stone idols to be pulled down, and the men tied ropes around the necks of these and dragged them to the site. All this struck terror and amazement in the hearts of the Miyako, Kyoto citizens, for they deeply venerated their idols. What he's touching on here is how Oda Nobunaga was very ruthless and in crushing his enemies, first off, and many of them who were monks, in fact. And Oda Nobunaga is famous for razing the Tendai temple on Hiezan at Enryakuji, and also destroying many other temples as well, because they had amassed lots of political power and followers, in fact. But so this is kind of probably something similar that he's describing here, tearing down especially Buddhist idols and Buddhist temples. And so a noble and his retainers would carry away a certain number of stones from each monastery every day, and as all were eager to please Nobunaga and not depart one iota from his wishes, they smashed the stone altars, toppled over and broke up the hotoke, Buddha images, and carried away the pieces in carts. Other men went off to work in quarries, others carted away earth, others cut down timber in the hills. In fact, the whole operation resembled the building of the temple in Jerusalem or the labors of Dido in Carthage. He decreed that while the work was in progress, none of the monasteries, either inside or outside the city, should toll its bells. He set up a bell in the castle to summon and dismiss the men, and as soon as it was rung, all the chief nobles and their retainers would begin working. He always strode around girded about with a tiger skin on which to sit and wearing rough and coarse clothing. Following his example, everyone wore skins and no one dared to appear before him in court dress while the building was still in progress. While on the site one day, he happened to see a soldier lifting up a woman's cloak slightly in order to get a glimpse of her face, and there and then the king struck off his head with his own hand. The most marvelous thing about the whole operation was the incredible speed with which the work was carried out. It looked as if 4 or 5 years would be needed to complete the masonry work, yet he had finished within 70 days. So this is an interesting description of Oda Nobunaga's castle, the building of Oda Nobunaga's castle. According to Louie Freud, there were many people working on it, and it seems from his description that Oda Nobunaga even put some of the court nobles to work. And in any case, this demonstrates, how Oda Nobunaga, not only his ruthlessness as a leader, but how he's, really trying to exercise his power and control over court nobles who had lost much of their power at this time. And this trend would be carried on then into the next major period that we'll look at later, the Tokugawa period. Okay, so first just some questions then to recap and to touch on and to think about some of the main points that I just talked about in this short talk. One, who were the Sengoku daimyo? How did they get their power, and what did they do? 2, describe the 3 types of towns: castle towns, port towns, and commercial districts. 3, who was Francis Xavier, and what did he do? 4, what were some consequences of European interaction and trade? 5, describe some of the observations of Louie Freud. What were some things that he wrote about? And then, along with this, I want to look deeper at some of Louie Freud's observations and do a primary source analysis. So I've compiled some of his writings from the 2 main translations that I mentioned earlier into a worksheet. And we can use this worksheet, read the worksheet first, and then based on that, consider and answer these next 4 questions. What things was Freud's attention drawn to? Why do you think this was the case? What do Freud's observations tell us about Japanese culture at the time? What did they tell us about European culture? Now, I want to point out here that Freud is describing Japanese culture, but as I said, some of his descriptions are a bit superficial, stereotypical, and it seems more that he's reflecting on his own culture or perhaps perpetuating his own biases, which really tells us something about his own values, and hence, in a sense, provides a lens onto European culture at this time. 3, how accurate do you think this source is? How much of it do you think is biased, and why? 4, what can we learn from this source today? Okay, so that wraps up my talk for today, and I'll continue providing more lectures as we move forward in Japanese history, but today I just talked about the Warring States period very briefly, and then introduced a source analysis project. And if you do that, I hope you enjoy looking at some of the writings of Louie Freud as well, because some of them are quite interesting. So thanks for listening.